I wasn't invited for love. I was invited to remember what I lost. The invitation sat in my hand like a quiet accusation, cream paper, gold lettering, the kind that cost more than my weekly groceries. And for a moment, I almost didn't walk in, almost turned around, almost chose dignity over curiosity. But then I thought about my son asleep at home, about the questions he would ask one day, and I stepped inside anyway. The ballroom glowed like something out of a movie, chandeliers dripping light over polished marble floors, laughter rising in soft waves, glasses clinking like a language I no longer spoke, and I felt it immediately. That shift, that invisible line where everyone else belonged, and I didn't. I adjusted the simple navy dress I had worn twice before, smoothed it down like it might somehow transform into something worthy, but fabric couldn't fix history, and history had already decided who I was in this room. A single mom, 27, no ring, no partner, just a polite smile and a past people pretended not to remember while quietly judging anyway. I found my seat at the far table near the back, the one closest to the exit, like they'd planned for me to leave early, and I sat down slowly, placing my clutch in my lap like armor, my fingers curling around it tighter than necessary. Conversations drifted around me, soft at first, then clearer, fragments slipping through the noise. She came alone? I heard she has a kid. That must be hard. Hard. The word landed heavier than it should have. I kept my eyes on the table setting, the folded napkin, the polished silverware lined up with precision, like everything here had its place except me. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I had moved on. But the truth was quieter, sharper, harder to ignore. I had loved once in a room just like this, under lights just like these, believing I was part of something permanent. I had been wrong. A server passed by, offering champagne, and I shook my head, my throat too tight for anything sparkling, too aware of the way my reflection might look in the glass. Tired eyes, careful smile, a woman holding herself together out of habit, not ease. I checked my phone under the table, a quick glance at the photo of my son, his messy hair, his bright grin, the reminder I carried everywhere, and for a second, everything softened. He was my reason, my anchor, the only place I truly belonged. I slipped the phone back into my bag just as the music shifted, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opening with a quiet authority that didn't need volume to command attention, and something changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But people noticed. Conversations paused just a fraction too long. Heads turned without meaning to, and I felt it before I saw him. The presence of someone who didn't need to ask for space because the room gave it willingly. I looked up slowly, almost against my own instincts, and there he was. Tall, composed, dark suit cut perfectly, like it had been made for him alone. He didn't smile. He didn't rush. He simply walked, and people moved. Not out of fear, not exactly, but out of recognition, like they understood something I didn't. My breath caught for a reason I couldn't explain, something subtle and unsettling tightening in my chest as his gaze swept across the room, calculated, precise, missing nothing. I told myself he would pass by, that men like him didn't notice women like me, that whatever power he carried belonged to a different world entirely. And then his eyes found mine. Just for a second, maybe less, but it was enough. Enough to make the noise fade, enough to make the air feel different, enough to make me sit a little straighter without knowing why. I looked away first, of course I did, my pulse quickening in a way I refused to examine, my fingers tightening again around my clutch as if it could ground me, as if anything could. Because something about that look felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. Or maybe worse, like a decision that had already been made. The moment I looked away, I told myself it meant nothing. Just another man in an expensive suit. Just another stranger passing through a world that had never included me. But the air did not settle the way it should have. It stayed tight, like something unfinished was hanging between us, and I could feel it in the way my shoulders refused to relax, in the way my pulse stayed just a little too fast for a quiet wedding reception. I reached for my water glass instead, needing something steady, something normal, my fingers brushing against the cool surface as I took a slow sip, focusing on the small details, the condensation on the glass, the faint citrus in the water, anything to ground myself back into a reality that made sense. Around me, conversations picked back up, laughter filling the space again like nothing had shifted, like nothing had changed, but I knew better, because across the room, movement still followed him, subtle but undeniable, people adjusting their posture, their tone, their attention, as if his presence rewrote the rules without ever speaking a word. I kept my gaze down, tracing the edge of my plate with my fingertip, pretending interest in the place setting, pretending I had not felt that look, that brief, impossible moment of being seen in a way that made me uncomfortable for reasons I could not name. "You should not have come," a voice said beside me, light but edged, and I turned slightly to find one of the bridesmaids standing too close, her smile polite, but her eyes sharp, the kind of kindness that never quite reached sincerity. I forced a small smile back, the one I had practiced over the years, the one that kept conversations short and expectations lower. "I was invited," I said quietly, keeping my tone even, keeping my posture calm, because experience had taught me that reacting only gave people more to work with. She let out a soft laugh, glancing toward the head table where my past sat in a tailored suit, smiling like history had been rewritten in his favor. "I suppose that is technically true," she said, her voice dropping just enough to make it personal. "But some invitations are more about courtesy than presence." The words landed exactly where she intended, not loud enough to draw attention, not soft enough to ignore, and for a second, I felt it, that old familiar sting, the reminder that I had once belonged somewhere I no longer did. I straightened slightly, letting the silence sit between us instead of filling it, because I had learned that dignity sometimes sounded like nothing at all, and after a moment, she shifted, clearly disappointed by the lack of reaction, smoothing her dress as she stepped away, her attention already drifting to someone more fitting, someone who matched the picture this room wanted to paint. I exhaled slowly, unaware I had been holding my breath, and for a moment, I considered leaving, slipping out quietly, disappearing before the night carved any deeper into something I had worked hard to rebuild. But then I thought about the version of myself that used to run, the version that chose silence over presence, and I stayed. I adjusted in my seat, lifting my chin just enough to change the way I held myself. Not for them, not for anyone else, but for me, because I had earned that much. The music shifted again, a softer melody now, something meant for slow dances and easy moments, and couples began to move toward the floor, hands finding each other, laughter softening into something more intimate, more certain, and I watched for a second longer than I meant to, not with longing, not exactly, but with a quiet awareness of distance, of paths that had diverged long before this night. I reached for my phone again, not to check the time, not really, but to remind myself of something real, something that mattered beyond this room, my thumb brushing over the screen before it lit up, his picture still there, still bright, still enough. And that was when I felt it again, not a glance this time, not a passing moment, but something closer, something deliberate, like the space beside me had shifted without sound. I looked up slowly, my breath catching before I could stop it, because he was no longer across the room. He was standing right next to my table, close enough that I could see the exact shade of his eyes under the chandelier light, close enough that the quiet confidence in his posture felt less like distance and more like gravity, and for a second, neither of us spoke, but the silence was not empty. It was charged, precise, like something was about to happen and the rest of the world had simply not caught up yet. He did not ask if he could sit. He simply pulled the chair beside me and did it anyway, like the space had already been his before he decided to take it, and the quiet confidence of that single action made something in my chest tighten in a way I did not like. Up close, he was even more composed than I had expected, every detail precise, from the clean line of his suit to the stillness in the way he held himself, like movement was something he chose carefully, not something that happened by accident. For a second, I forgot how to speak, which was ridiculous, because he was just a man, just another guest at a wedding I did not belong to. But there was something about him that made the usual rules feel less certain. "You are sitting alone," he said, his voice low, even, not a question, not quite an observation either, more like a statement that did not need confirmation. I let out a small breath, steadying myself before answering, because I refused to let him see the way his presence unsettled me. "I am fine," I said, keeping my tone polite but distant, the way you learn to speak when you have had to build your own boundaries from scratch. His gaze did not shift, did not soften. It stayed exactly where it was, like he was reading something deeper than my words, something I had not given permission to be seen. Fine is a convenient word, he replied after a moment, his tone unchanged. But there was something beneath it now, something sharper, like he knew the difference between truth and what people said to avoid it. I almost laughed at that, almost pushed back, because I had spent years learning how to survive conversations like this, how to deflect, how to keep control, but something told me this would not be that simple. "Why are you here?" I asked instead, turning the question back to him, because I needed something to anchor the moment, something that gave me ground again. His expression did not change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something deliberate. "I was invited," he said, and for some reason, the simplicity of the answer felt less like truth and more like strategy. "Of course you were," I replied quietly, glancing around the room where people still moved carefully around him without realizing they were doing it. "You seem like someone people want to have around." He followed my gaze briefly, then looked back at me. "People want many things," he said, "but that does not mean they understand what they are asking for." The words settled between us, heavier than they should have been, and for a moment, I forgot about the wedding, about the whispers, about the way I had been made to feel small just minutes ago, because somehow, sitting next to him felt like stepping into a different version of the night, one where the rules were still unclear, but no longer entirely against me. "I should go," I said suddenly, the instinct rising without warning, because something about this felt like the edge of something I was not ready to step into. And I had a life outside this room, a son waiting at home, a reality that did not include men like him making decisions that did not belong to them. I reached for my clutch, pushing my chair back slightly, but before I could stand, his hand moved, not touching me, not stopping me, just resting on the table close enough to change the space between us, and somehow, that was enough. "You could," he said calmly, his voice steady, controlled, but there was something beneath it now that made my breath catch, something that felt less like suggestion and more like inevitability. "But if you leave now, you will walk out exactly the way you walked in." I paused, my fingers tightening around my bag as I looked at him again, confusion mixing with something I refused to name, and before I could ask what he meant, before I could decide whether to stay or go, he stood, smooth and effortless, and extended his hand toward me like the next part of the night had already been decided without me. And when he spoke again, his voice carried just enough to shift the attention of the nearest tables. Precise, deliberate, impossible to ignore, my wife should not sit alone at a wedding. The words did not just land, they echoed, not loud enough to cause a scene, but precise enough to shift the air around us. And I felt it immediately, the subtle pause in nearby conversations, the quiet turning of heads, the kind of attention that did not need permission to exist. My breath caught before I could stop it, my mind scrambling to catch up with what he had just said, because there was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of humor, nothing that suggested this was a joke I was meant to understand. I stared at his hand for a second too long, extended toward me, steady, patient, like he had all the time in the world and none of the doubt, and everything in me pushed back against it. "I am not your wife," I said quietly, the words sharper than I intended but necessary, because if I did not draw that line now, I might lose it entirely. His expression did not change, not even a flicker, but there was something in his eyes that shifted, something almost approving, like resistance was not a problem to him, just another detail to account for. "Not yet," he replied, his tone calm, controlled, as if the distinction was temporary, as if the moment we were standing in had already decided its own outcome. My pulse quickened, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that he believed what he was saying, not in the literal sense, not in a way that required explanation, but in a way that made it real enough for everyone watching. I should have refused again, should have stood up and walked away, should have reminded myself that I did not belong to anyone. But then I noticed it, the way people were looking now, not with quiet judgment like before, but with something else, something closer to curiosity, to calculation, and I understood, in a way that made my chest tighten, that whatever he was doing, it had already changed the story being told about me in this room. My fingers tightened around my clutch, the weight of the moment pressing in, and for a second, I thought about my son again, about the life waiting outside these walls, about the version of myself that had fought too hard to be reduced to someone else's decision, and I almost pulled back. But then I saw my past across the room, his attention fixed on us now, his expression no longer relaxed, no longer certain, and something inside me shifted, not revenge, not exactly, but a quiet refusal to shrink any further than I already had. I placed my hand in his. It was a simple motion, small, controlled, but the moment our fingers touched, something changed, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a subtle shift in balance, like I had stepped into a space where the rules were different and I had agreed, at least for now, to play by them. He did not tighten his grip, did not pull, just closed his hand around mine with a steadiness that felt intentional. And then he moved, guiding me away from the table with a confidence that did not require force, because people moved before we reached them, space opening without question, without hesitation. I felt every step, every glance, every unspoken reaction as we crossed the room, the weight of attention following us like a current, and I kept my head up, not because I was comfortable, but because I refused to look like I was not. We stopped near the center of the room, close enough to the dance floor that the music wrapped around us, soft and deliberate. And for a second, I wondered if this was part of it too, if everything he did was this calculated, this precise. "You do not have to pretend," I said under my breath, my voice low enough that only he could hear, because I needed to understand where the line was, where this ended and something else began. He looked down at me then, closer than before, his gaze steady, unwavering, and for the first time, there was something different in it, something less distant, more focused, like I was no longer just a situation he had stepped into, but something he had chosen to stay with. "I do not pretend," he said simply, and the certainty in his voice made my heart stutter in a way I could not explain. The music shifted slightly, slower now, more deliberate, and before I could decide what to do with that answer, his hand moved again, not asking, not forcing, just guiding, resting lightly at my waist in a way that was firm but respectful, leaving me the space to pull away if I wanted to, and somehow, that made it harder to do exactly that. Around us, the room continued as if nothing unusual had happened, but I knew better, because everything had changed, not just for them, not just for the way they saw me, but for me too, because in that moment, standing in a place I had almost left, with a man I did not understand, I realized something I had not expected. I was no longer invisible. His hand at my waist was steady, not demanding, not careless, just there, like a quiet anchor in the middle of a room that suddenly felt too aware of me. And for a second, I forgot how to move, forgot how to think past the fact that everyone was watching in a way they had not been before. The music wrapped around us, soft and slow, something meant for people who belonged together, and I almost stepped back, almost broke whatever illusion he had created, but my feet did not move, and that unsettled me more than anything else. "You are doing this on purpose," I said under my breath, my voice controlled but edged, because I needed to remind both of us that this was a choice, not something inevitable. His gaze did not leave mine. Calm, unreadable. "I do not do anything without purpose," he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, just fact, the kind that did not need to be defended. I swallowed, aware of the way his words settled somewhere deeper than I expected, aware of the way my pulse refused to slow, and I told myself it was just the attention, just the sudden shift from invisible to seen, nothing more. "Then why me?" I asked, because that question mattered, because if I did not understand his reason, I could not control what came next. For a moment, he did not answer, his hand adjusting slightly, not tightening, just steadying, like he was giving me time to realize something on my own. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, like the answer was not meant for anyone else, because you needed it. The words hit harder than they should have, simple, direct, impossible to dismiss, and I almost laughed, almost told him he did not know anything about what I needed, but something in his expression stopped me, something that suggested he was not guessing. "You do not know me," I said instead, softer now, because the certainty in his tone had unsettled something I kept carefully guarded. "No," he agreed, and for the first time, there was the slightest shift in his voice, not doubt, not hesitation, but something closer to honesty. "But I know what it looks like when a room decides. Someone does not belong." The truth of that landed without warning, sharp and quiet, and I felt it in the way my shoulders tensed, in the way my breath caught just slightly, because he was not wrong, and I hated that he had seen it, hated that anyone had. The music carried us a step to the left, then another, slow and measured. And I let it happen. Let the movement give me something to focus on besides the weight of his words, besides the way this moment was starting to feel less like a performance and more like something real. Around us, people continued to watch, but the tone had changed, the curiosity now mixed with something else, something closer to respect, and I realized with a quiet shock that no one was whispering anymore. They were observing. That difference mattered more than I expected. You could have just ignored it, I said after a moment, my voice steadier now, because I needed to understand why someone like him would involve himself in something so small, so personal. He looked at me then, really looked, like he was measuring not just my words but everything behind them. And when he answered, there was no hesitation. I do not ignore things that interest me. The implication was clear, and I felt it in the way my chest tightened again, in the way my mind tried to push back against something that was moving too fast, too easily, into territory I had spent years avoiding. This is not real, I said quietly, more to myself than to him, because I needed to hold on to that, needed to remember that whatever this was, it had an end. His hand stilled slightly at my waist, not leaving, just pausing, like he was acknowledging the line I had drawn without stepping back from it. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm, certain, and entirely too steady for what he was saying. It is real enough for tonight. I let out a slow breath, my gaze dropping for a second before lifting again, meeting his eyes with something more grounded now, because if I was going to stand here, if I was going to let this moment exist, then it would be on my terms too. One night, I repeated, my voice quiet but firm, because I needed to hear it said out loud, needed to anchor myself to something that would not shift under me. One night, he confirmed, and there was no hesitation in it, no hidden condition, just agreement. And for the first time since he had walked into my space, I felt something close to control return, small but real. The music slowed even further, the room fading just slightly at the edges as the moment settled into something quieter, more focused, and I realized something I had not expected when I walked into this place alone. For the first time that night, I was not thinking about leaving. The agreement settled between us like something fragile, simple in words but heavier in meaning. And for a moment, I let myself breathe inside it. Just one night. Just a borrowed version of something I had not had in a long time. Something that felt steady even if it was not real. His hand remained at my waist, unchanged, not claiming more than I had allowed. And that detail mattered more than I wanted to admit, because it meant I could still step away if I chose to. It meant this was not control, not exactly, even if it felt dangerously close to it. The song shifted again. The rhythm softer, slower, and we moved with it without thinking, like the space between us had already found its balance. And I focused on that, on the movement, on the simple fact that for once, I was not being watched with judgment, but with something closer to curiosity, maybe even respect, and that alone was enough to keep me there. You are still thinking about leaving, he said quietly, not as a question, and I let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh, because of course he noticed. Of course, nothing about me in this moment was invisible to him. I always think about leaving, I answered honestly, because that was easier than pretending otherwise, easier than explaining the instinct that had been built over years, the habit of not staying anywhere longer than I was wanted. His gaze softened, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to see, but enough for me to feel the difference. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something steadier, something that felt less like observation and more like intention. Then do not leave yet. The words were simple, but they settled deeper than I expected, not because of what they meant, but because of how they were said, not as a command, not as a demand, but as a choice he was offering instead of taking. I studied him for a second, really studied him this time. The quiet control, the way he held the moment without forcing it, the way he made space without stepping back, and I realized something that shifted the ground under me in a way I had not prepared for. He was not trying to impress anyone in this room. He was not even trying to convince me. He had already decided something, and everything else was just the result of that decision. Why does it matter if I stay? I asked, because I needed to understand the reason behind that certainty, needed to find the edge of it before I stepped too far inside. His hand stilled slightly again, not tightening, just grounding, and when he answered, his voice was quieter than before, like the truth did not need to be loud to exist, because you are the only one here who is not pretending. The honesty in that caught me off guard, sharper than anything else he had said, and for a moment I had no response, no practiced answer, nothing to deflect with, because he was not wrong, and I had not expected anyone in this room to notice that. The music carried us another step, then another, and I felt it again, that strange sense of balance, of something shifting in a way I could not fully control but was no longer trying to fight. Around us, the room continued, conversations rising and falling, laughter threading through the music, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to a different version of the night, one I was no longer part of. My phone vibrated softly in my clutch, the familiar buzz pulling me back for just a second, and I glanced down instinctively, my heart tightening as I saw the screen light up with a message from the babysitter, just a simple update. He is asleep, everything is fine, and the relief that followed was immediate, grounding, real. You have a child, he said, not asking, just stating, and I looked up quickly, my breath catching in a way I could not hide. This time, because I had not told him that, had not given him that piece of me. Yes, I answered after a second, my voice quieter now, more guarded, because that part of my life was not something I let strangers step into easily. He nodded once, like the confirmation fit into something he already understood, and there was no judgment in his expression, no hesitation, just acceptance, simple and unspoken. That changes things, he said, and I felt the shift in those words immediately, the way they carried more weight than anything else he had said so far. And for the first time since this moment had begun, I was not sure if that made this easier or more complicated. How? I asked, my voice steady but careful, because the answer mattered more than I wanted it to. His gaze held mine, unwavering, and when he spoke, it was with the same quiet certainty that had followed him since the moment he walked into the room. It means I choose more carefully. The words lingered, settling into the space between us, and I realized then that whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into when I placed my hand in his, it was no longer just about surviving the night. It was becoming something I had not planned for. The way he said it stayed with me longer than it should have, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and certain, like a decision that had already been made somewhere deeper than words, and I felt it settle into the space between us in a way that made it hard to ignore. Choose more carefully. I should have pushed back, should have reminded him that I was not something to be chosen at all, not by him, not by anyone. But the truth was, part of me did not want to break whatever this was just yet. The music slowed into something softer, almost fading into the background, and without realizing it, my hand had relaxed slightly in his, the tension I had been holding loosening just enough to feel the difference. You talk like everything is already decided, I said after a moment, my voice quieter now, less defensive, because I needed to understand where this certainty came from, needed to find the edge of it before it pulled me too far in. He did not look away, did not hesitate, because most things are, he answered simply, and there was no arrogance in it, just a calm acceptance that made it harder to argue with than it should have been. I shook my head slightly, a small, almost invisible motion. That might be true for you, I said, but not for me, because my life had never been about certainty. It had been about adapting, about adjusting, about surviving whatever came next without the luxury of knowing how it would turn out. His hand shifted slightly at my waist, not pulling me closer, just grounding the space between us again, like he understood the difference between holding on and letting go. And for some reason, that mattered more than anything else he had done so far. Then tell me what is not decided, he said, and the question caught me off guard, not because it was difficult, but because no one had asked me that in a long time. Not like this, not with the expectation that my answer actually mattered. I hesitated for a second, my thoughts catching up with the moment, because the truth was not simple, it was layered, complicated, tied to a life I had built piece by piece after everything else had fallen apart. Tomorrow, I said finally, my voice steady but softer now, because tomorrow was always the question, always the unknown, always the place where everything real existed, my son, my work, my life outside this room, none of that is decided. His gaze held mine, steady, focused, and for a second, I thought he might challenge that too, might find a way to turn even that into something certain, but instead, he nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he was accepting the answer instead of rewriting it. Then tonight matters more, he said, and the simplicity of that made my breath catch in a way I could not explain, because it reframed everything, not as something permanent, not as something inevitable, but as something contained, something that existed only here, only now. The music shifted again, the rhythm picking up slightly as other couples moved around us, laughter returning, conversations rising, and I became aware again of the room, of the way people still watched, but differently now, not with quiet judgment, not with whispered assumptions, but with something closer to curiosity, maybe even respect, and I realized that whatever he had done when he spoke those words earlier, it had not just changed how they saw me, it had changed how I moved within this space. My phone buzzed again softly in my clutch, and this time I did not look down, did not break the moment, because for the first time in a long time, I was not being pulled somewhere else. I was here, fully, completely, without needing to escape it. You are not what they expected, he said suddenly, his voice low enough that it felt like it belonged only to this space between us, and I frowned slightly, the words catching my attention in a different way than anything else he had said. What did they expect? I asked, because I knew the answer, but I wanted to hear how he would say it, wanted to understand how he saw it. He glanced briefly toward the room, toward the people who had watched me walk in, who had decided who I was before I even sat down, then looked back at me. Something easier, he said, something quieter. The honesty in that should have stung, but it did not. Not this time, because for once, it was not being used against me. It was just being acknowledged. And what do you expect? I asked, my voice steady, because if I was going to stand here, if I was going to let this moment exist, then I needed to know where I stood in his version of it. He did not answer immediately, his gaze holding mine like he was measuring something more than the question itself. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, but no less certain. I expect you to stay exactly as you are. The words settled in a way nothing else had, quiet but unshakable, and for the first time that night, I realized something that changed everything. I was no longer trying to prove anything to anyone in this room, not even to him. His words stayed with me longer than the music, longer than the movement, longer than the quiet shift of attention that still followed us wherever we stepped, because they did not feel like something meant to impress. They felt like something meant to hold, and I was not used to that. Stay exactly as you are. I should have questioned it, should have found the flaw in it, the hidden condition, the part that would eventually ask me to change, to adjust, to become easier to accept, but nothing in his expression suggested that, and that unsettled me more than anything else. The song ended softly, fading into a round of polite applause as couples stepped apart, and for a second, I expected him to let go, to step back, to end whatever this was with the same quiet control he had started it with, but he did not. His hand remained where it was, steady, grounding, as if the end of the music did not change the space between us at all. People began to move again, conversations rising, glasses clinking, the room returning to its usual rhythm, but the difference was still there, subtle but undeniable, because now when people looked at me, they did not look through me. They acknowledged me. That alone should have been enough to make me step away, to thank him silently, and reclaim the distance I had spent years building. But my feet did not move, and I realized it was not because of them. It was because of him. We should sit, I said quietly, my voice steady but softer now, because standing in the center of the room felt like holding a spotlight I had not asked for, and I was not sure how long I could carry it without breaking the illusion. He nodded once, not questioning, not correcting, just accepting, and guided me back toward the edge of the room where the tables waited, where the noise softened just enough to feel manageable again. As we sat, the shift followed us, subtle but clear, the way the server approached our table first this time, the way nearby conversations lowered slightly instead of sharpening, and I noticed it all, every small change, every quiet difference, because I had spent too long learning how to read a room that did not want me in it. You changed everything with one sentence, I said after a moment, not accusing, not grateful, just stating what was obvious, because I needed to understand the weight of what he had done, needed to know if he understood it too. He reached for the glass of water in front of him, his movements calm, unhurried, and when he answered, his voice carried that same quiet certainty I was beginning to recognize. I adjusted the room, he said, as if the distinction mattered. as if it explained something I was still trying to grasp. I watched him for a second, trying to understand how someone could say something like that without hesitation, without doubt, and I realized it was not confidence in the usual sense. It was control, not over me, not even over them, but over himself. And that kind of control was something I had only ever built out of necessity, not choice. A shadow passed briefly across the table, and I looked up to see my past standing there, his expression carefully neutral, his posture too straight, like he was holding himself together in a way that felt unfamiliar. And for a second, the room narrowed again, the old version of this space pressing in around me, threatening to undo everything that had just shifted. "I did not expect to see you here," he said, his tone polite but tight, and I felt the old instinct rise, the one that told me to shrink, to apologize, to make this easier for everyone else, but it did not take hold the way it used to. Before I could answer, before I could decide which version of myself to be in this moment, the man beside me moved slightly, not stepping forward, not interrupting, just enough to change the balance again, enough to remind the room of what had already been said. "She is with me," he said calmly, not loud, not aggressive, just clear, and the effect was immediate, the tension shifting, the unspoken questions settling into something more certain. My past hesitated, just for a second, just long enough to reveal something I had not seen before, uncertainty. And then he nodded once, his gaze flicking between us before stepping back, retreating into the version of the night that no longer included me. I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, my shoulders relaxing just slightly as the moment passed. And for the first time since I had walked into that room, I felt something I had not expected to find here. Not relief. Not exactly. Something steadier. Something closer to safety. I turned my head, slightly, looking at him again, really looking this time, and realized something that changed the shape of everything that had come before. This was not just about one night anymore. Not for him. And maybe not for me either. The quiet that followed his words did not feel empty. It felt settled, like something had been placed exactly where it belonged. And for the first time that night, I was not bracing for what came next. I watched the room continue around us, the soft rhythm of conversation returning, the careful laughter, the clinking glasses, but it no longer pressed in the same way. It no longer felt like something I had to endure. It felt distant, manageable, almost irrelevant. I should have been relieved, should have taken that moment as my exit, the perfect place to step away with my dignity intact and the night rewritten just enough to feel different, but I did not move. Instead, I stayed where I was, my attention shifting back to him, to the man who had walked into a space that had rejected me and changed it without raising his voice, without asking permission. "You do this often," I said quietly, not accusing, not curious in the usual way, just trying to understand the pattern behind someone who moved like this, who decided things without hesitation and expected the world to adjust accordingly. His gaze met mine, steady as always, and for a moment, I thought he might deflect, might give me something vague or controlled, but he did not. "No," he said simply, and there was no pause, no reconsideration, just truth. "Not like this." The answer settled into me slowly, because it meant something I had not expected, something that shifted the weight of everything that had happened so far. "Not like this." I looked down briefly, my fingers tracing the edge of the table again, grounding myself in something small, something real, because the alternative felt too large, too uncertain. "This ends tonight," I said after a moment, my voice calm but deliberate, because I needed to hear it, needed to place a boundary around something that was already beginning to stretch beyond what I had agreed to. One night. That was the deal. His expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes that shifted, not disagreement, not challenge, just acknowledgement, like he understood exactly why I needed to say it out loud. "Tonight ends," he agreed, and the way he said it made my breath catch, because he had not said everything ends, he had not promised distance or closure, he had simply confirmed the part one had defined, leaving the rest open in a way that felt intentional. I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something I could push against, something I could use to remind myself that this was temporary, controlled, contained, but I did not find it. Instead, I found something steadier, something quieter, something that made it harder to walk away even when I knew I should. My phone buzzed again, softer this time, and I finally reached for it, my thumb brushing across the screen as I read the message. Still asleep. All good. And I let out a slow breath, the kind that settles deep in your chest, the kind that reminds you where your real life is, where your responsibilities are, where your heart belongs. He watched me without asking, without intruding, just observing, and that restraint, that simple decision not to take more than I was willing to give, made something shift inside me in a way I had not prepared for. I slipped the phone back into my bag and looked up at him again, clearer now, steadier, because I had something to hold on to outside of this moment. I have a life that does not include this, I said, not as a rejection, not as a warning, just a fact, because if this was going to mean anything at all, it had to exist alongside the truth of who I was beyond this room. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he had already considered that, like it had never been a problem to solve. I know, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to minimize or redefine what I had just said, just acceptance, simple and complete. The ease of that response unsettled me more than resistance would have, because it meant he was not trying to fit me into his world. He was acknowledging that mine existed separately, equally, and that changed everything. The music rose again, another song beginning, the night continuing exactly as it had been planned for everyone else, but not for me, not anymore, because somewhere between sitting alone at that table and standing here now, something had shifted in a way I could not undo. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze still on him, my thoughts quieter than they had been all evening, and I realized something that felt both simple and impossible at the same time. I had come here expecting to be reminded of what I lost. Instead, I was being shown something I had never considered keeping. And the most unsettling part was not that he had chosen me for one night. It was that he had not let me feel temporary at all.